Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you? Good morning. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you? Good morning. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning.
Morning. Yes. Yep.
Hello,
Good
everyone.
morning. Hi, everyone. Sorry, there seems to be a delay. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning.
Morning. Yes. Yep. You can, Tamika.
Good morning, Tamika. This is Tamara. First time using YouTube live stream, so there was an echo for a moment as I was muting the live stream. So apologies.
It's okay. I just sent that message to you. I'm like, I think there's a delay. It sounds like I'm repeating myself saying good morning, good morning, good morning.
We got that figured out. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is 9:02. We will go ahead and get started as people continue to join in. Just really quickly, so that you know the format we have here today, we are using just a regular Zoom meeting room. So you're welcome to turn on or off your video as you like. If you have questions, at least for the first introduction here, if you could just put them in the chat, that would be great. And then we will be sharing evaluations throughout the day, today and tomorrow. We'll be putting the links for those in the chat, so we'd really appreciate if you give us that feedback right away. We'll also be adding some other links in the chat with our speakers, so be on the lookout for those. And otherwise, please just make sure you're muted. Everyone is muted on entry so that our speakers are getting.
Excuse me, can I interrupt for a second? And we just want to know if you can hear us here.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I will hand it over to Eric to do our introduction.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, just so happy to be together with everyone today. As I was thinking about this year and what brings us here, I think the word unprecedented is now broken. We've been through unprecedented times, and it's an interesting context that I'm not sure what we're returning back to next year. I'm not sure it's the old precedent either. So our world is changing in lots of ways, and you'll see a lot of those themes throughout the next 2 days as well. Next slide. Again, want to welcome you to Minnesota. We jumped straight into midsummer, and now we're kind of sliding a little bit back into that June weather that we look forward to when school is done. You just want to take a nice chance to bring together people out throughout the state through something like the Summer Institute to be able to connect with each other. One thing I really appreciate about that is the learning we can do from each other. New implementers, future implementers, longtime implementers, and connecting with national partners as well. So we're really pleased to bring this community together and make some connections to help us move forward together. Next slide. When we do presentations at the Department of Education, we always highlight our 10 commitments to equity, and we're working on all of these and more that aren't listed. But the ones I really wanted to highlight that you'll see in the opening, in the keynote by Dr. LaSalle and throughout the 2 days, is we're really focusing on prioritizing equity, measuring what matters, and going local in terms of looking at real specific local implementation that can really match up the intentions with and aspirations with what's really happening and make it stronger and better. Next slide. As we start, a lot of things have happened this year, and we wanted to acknowledge, again, the loss of Dante Wright. And as a state, we offer our deepest condolences to the Wright family. It feels like this is a cycle that we continue learning and experiencing from as well, and it can seem distant and in the community. In this particular case, you know, Dante Wright was murdered just a couple miles from where I grew up. And as we think about also George Floyd, Philando Castile, and others, the impact in community of these events and the undertones and the impact for the work that we're doing on equity, the difference between intention and impact, a number of things really strongly direct back there. So we wanted to start by really honoring the life and acknowledging the loss that we've all experienced this last year and for several years. I'm gonna click that, yep. And there's a state proclamation on April 22nd that had a quote that said, "We must continue the work to enact real meaningful change at the local, state, national levels to fight systemic racism so that every person in Minnesota, Black, Indigenous, brown, and white can be safe and thrive." And I think, again, you'll see themes throughout our next 2 days that really show specific things that you can do and really how we use some of the frameworks that we have, how we use the practices we have, how we revisit our intentions and beliefs, and review that in terms of what the impact really is kind of moving forward to really embody those commitments to equity. Next slide. One of the things that really has changed in the last year is that setting context. Again, our agency came out with a plan, the new Due North Education Plan, and that alignment from an agency that really supports the context of the work that we're going to be talking about moving forward, and the governor and the legislature as well, really seeing commitment and coming together around meeting the needs of students during and after the pandemic. We're continuing to think about through that summer and as we prepare for return to classrooms in the fall, ensuring that every student receives a world-class education, every student learns in a safe and nurturing environment, ensuring that every student learns in a classroom with caring and qualified teachers, expanding access and opportunities for students of color and Indigenous students, and expanding opportunities for students in greater Minnesota. Again, a real high level, we could do a presentation just on this, but there are a lot of resources available. The point I wanted to acknowledge is really that setting context that really helps support the work that we are engaged in moving forward in partnership in that way. Next slide. Just a few years ago, Kent McIntosh was here talking about enhancing equity in school discipline. He did a presentation on practical strategies and tools, and I think about, you know, both what he shared with us, focusing on the awareness of the issues, but getting into the practical strategies, what we do and what impact they have. And I think about, you know, the thing that he shared with us at that time that's resonating even more and sets the stage for Dr. LaSalle's keynote is really thinking about that many things are, what we're seeing is the impact is different and misaligned with attitudes and beliefs. And so we know that attitudes and beliefs are very important. And we know that several things that are happening out in our community, whether it's through implicit bias or other things, are really illuminating kind of a reality that the actions are inconsistent with the stated and personally held attitudes and beliefs that people have. And I think that's an interesting one to think about and continue reflecting upon as we go through the next 2 days. Next slide. One presentation I wanted to call to your attention. You can download the presentation, but at the recent APBS conference, we were able to really highlight 2 specific districts that are really doing work to scale up implementation across their district and really address both aligned initiatives and supports within the PBIS framework, and also using those frameworks to address equity. And we highlighted St. Paul schools. Aaron Metz described the district level kind of planning and coordination. And then the specific school example under that was Battle Creek Middle School with Lanisha Paddock as principal and Paul Richardson as the assistant principal. And then in Osseo schools, Kate Evans, the special ed director, gave the district view and highlighted a specific school example within that at Northview Middle School with Diana Bledsoe, the principal, and Alex Berg, the assistant principal. Great presentation full of really practical strategies, and you can see the impact of focused implementation over years and using that continuous improvement process to get stronger, regenerate, and keep filling out those frameworks with aligned initiatives and practices. So if you have time, you can check that out as well. Next slide. One of my favorite parts of the Summer Institute as we close the school year is really thinking about exemplar schools. And I'm super excited to hear the presentations of those awards tomorrow. Spoiler alert, 45 schools will be recognized in 7 districts for their outstanding work. And we know there are many more that actually met criteria that in the busyness of the last year and others just didn't have the time, energy, or patience to put the application together to do that. But we thought, especially given the challenging circumstances, it's important to really highlight the great work that's happening. And especially in those circumstances, in the challenging circumstances of the past year, this work, this support, the predictability of consistent, safe, structured environments in a supportive context for students have never been more important, and that will continue to be the case as we return to school in the fall. So again, we'll look forward to seeing those specific examples. There is a Sustain an Exemplar webpage where you'll see more details about those as well. But really it's highlighting again that demonstrated fidelity of implementation of PBIS, and then looking at things like sustainability practices, ways that they give back, collection and use of data, commitments to equity, and aligned initiatives and practices that they're integrating to make their system stronger. So great examples. We'll look forward to that. It's one of my favorite parts of June. Next slide. As we think about the Summer Institute, again, this will be recorded. So if you have friends that can't make it again, or if you hear an idea that's so good, you might need to hear it again. The information will be recorded, posted, and available at the site link that's there. Previewing our next couple of days, just super grateful to our presenters, and a challenging year to be able to kind of bring together and share, muster the energy to do this at the end of the year is fantastic, and we very much appreciate that. We'll be hearing from Dr. LaSalle shortly, and I'll preview that in just a minute. But we're also excited about other, we've heard from the feedback we've gotten from you that people want to hear more about classroom management practices, culturally linguistic and responsive teaching strategies, establishing preliminary evidence for culturally responsive PBIS with an example of the personal matrix activity, district teams, how they work to align those initiatives from pre-K through grade 12. We have an adult student panel Q&A. We have integrating PBIS efforts into improvement plans and planning processes. We have a presentation on paving your way back after a significant event, and how to incorporate PBIS strategies into the use of video, or use video to incorporate those. So we're super excited about those range of presentations and grateful to the presenters that are here to share with us today. Shameless plug for the future is we love to have local implementation examples. So already put on the calendar alert for next June. We love to learn from those local examples in places where you're really doing great work and sharing that with others around the state. It's a great part of our community to be able to offer that. Next slide. Again, as we prepare for the Institute, a couple things to think about. The presentations really connect PBIS practices that promote equitable outcomes in education. The context for this has really grown and expanded over the past 5 or more years, but is very pronounced this year with the impact of distance learning, hybrid, and return to in-person. Many issues related to equitable access and equitable outcomes have been highlighted and seen with new lenses. So the presentations today will help connect with those in ways that you can use those PBIS practices to really support that. Second, we've been lucky to have this partnership across 17 years of of implementation in Minnesota, and we've learned a lot from what it takes to get started, what it takes to keep it going, and how to integrate that with other meaningful work that we're doing as well. So you'll see examples of that as well. We're super grateful for our talented network of dedicated trainers, coaches, evaluators, and implementers from the field. This is a great chance to see and hear from all of them. And one thing that we've really learned over the time, and you'll see it in this institute as well, but when teams have access to their own practice and implementation data, their ability to action plan to make it better and sustain those practices is outstanding. So we've loved to see how this has gone over the course, and inspired by the work of individuals and teams to make that work. Next slide. We want to do a quick shout out to our colleague, Mary Hunt. She will be retiring in just a few days, and we didn't want that to go unacknowledged. She was one of the people that helped us put together the first Summer Institute. And as you can see, we just wanted to give you a reflection. She's often behind the scenes on something like the Summer Institute, but just a driving force and great teammate and inspiration, and has just done great work across a number of years. So we wanted to, first of all, acknowledge that when you really do produce great work over years and do it in a team context, and as you can see, just get a glimpse from some of the pictures, have some fun along the way. That really is an outstanding mix, and we wanted to acknowledge Mary in front of all of you. You may hear a thing or two more as we go through the sessions, but in the opening, we wanted to just say a special thanks to Mary. Next slide. So I wanted to introduce and set up our keynote speaker, Dr. Tamika LaSalle. We are so lucky that she is willing to join us, because the range of experience that she has, the perspectives nationally and across several states, is just so timely and helpful for us at this point. And we're very appreciative and grateful that she's here today with us. She comes with a range of experiences. First, as a special ed teacher in the state of Georgia, got a doctoral degree in school psychology from Georgia State University. And even though they're on mute, I can hear all the school psychologists cheering when they hear that as well. She has extensive experience in studying culturally responsive educational practices and school climate, with particular interest in the culture of students' educational experiences and developing and maintaining culturally responsive environments that are equitable, safe, positive for students, teachers, and families. There are a number of things that she does at UConn, and she's a part of several national grants really focused on prevention into intervention. And we're just so lucky and grateful that you're able to join us today. So with that, I will turn it over to our keynote, Dr. Tamika LaSalle.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to, am I able to share my screen? Yes.
Yes, you are, Tamika.
Got it. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me here today virtually. I think, like Eric said, this year has definitely been an unprecedented year. And, so I just want to start by saying thank you for all the work that all of you have done in the schools over the last year, because I know that it hasn't been easy. So my focus today is to talk about culture responsive PBIS, specifically leveraging existing systems to advance equity. So you'll see here that I put culture responsive within brackets. My charge for today is really to have you walk away with this idea that we shouldn't have to say culturally responsive PBIS, that when we say PBIS, culturally responsive is implied because it's the way that we do things. And so that is my charge. So you'll see me over and over talking about how do we remove the brackets and think about creating environments that are inherently designed to meet the cultural and contextual needs of students, families, and teachers. A little bit of background about the context of education. This is an area that I follow a lot. So we know that the number of non-English speaking children has doubled since 1979. Some reports say that the numbers will be up to 50% in the next several years. And what's interesting to me as I present these numbers is I remember maybe a decade ago or something, there were all these projections that by 2050 we'll have a majority minoritized student population. And, you know, that happened in 2014, or the first time in the 2015-2016 school year, where there was more than 50% of students represented from minoritized backgrounds. And when I talk about minoritized students, I'm talking about Black and Brown students, Latinx students, Asian American students, American Indian, and Alaskan Native students. And with that, the Latinx population alone has increased from 16 to 27% just within a 17-year period. So that is definitely the fastest growing student population that we have. When we look at students with disabilities, another critical group in education, we see that majority of students with disabilities, so American Indian students make up 17% of students with disabilities. And I want to put that in perspective a little bit, because what's in parentheses, that 1% represents the number of the percent of American Indian, Alaskan Native students in our entire public school system, right? So when you think about, they make up 1% of public schools, but they make up 17% of students with disabilities. For Black students, 16% and 15% respectively, white students, 14% and 47% respectively, and Latinx students, 12% and 27% respectively. So that is part of laying the sort of framework or the groundwork for what is the current context of our schools. The second thing that I follow a lot is the percentage of students in high poverty schools. And right now that number is higher than those that are in low poverty schools. So when you look at the demographics, we see about 45% of Black students are in high poverty schools compared to 8% of white students. Conversely, when I look at the percent of students that are in low poverty schools, we see the numbers almost flipped. Asian students, 40%, white students, 31% are in low poverty schools, where 7% and 8% of Latino or Latinx and Black students are in low poverty schools. So what does that say about the current context? You know, we know that that schools are changing. For those of you who've been in education for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, I'm sure that you can attest to the fact that the student population has changed over time. Even if you're in a school that's majority Black, even if you're in a school that's majority white, there's still cultural changes that have happened over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And that is going to be a critical point when I talk about culture today, is that even in schools that are all white or all Black or all Latinx, there's still cultural differences. If there weren't, then we would expect that all students would have the same outcomes, but we know that they don't. And so there are these intersecting identities that I'll talk a little bit more about that have an impact on the students that we work with. The other thing is, we look at this student population, it's incredibly diverse. We know that the teacher population is more than 70% white women primarily. And the same is true for administrators. What does that mean? Does it mean that we can't connect, or as white teachers, you can't connect with students who are Black and Brown? Absolutely not. What it means is that, again, we want to remove the brackets and think about how do we create environments that are responsive to the needs of our students, that are affirming. And there are multiple ways to do that. And so that's what I hope that you can walk away with today, is that we're not always going to connect based on race, but we can connect in different ways. A little bit quickly about my background and why I conceptualize things the way that I do. I grew up as a military brat. And so I lived for the first 7 years in Germany, then Alabama, then Colorado, Texas, Georgia, so on and so on. So when I first started teaching, I started teaching in Atlanta, Georgia, at a school that was about 90-something% Black students. And though we were all Black, we still had very different cultural experiences growing up. And so I've always thought about the impact of the school environment. I've always thought about school climate and what things in different schools made it comfortable for me, what things in different schools made it uncomfortable for me. And so that's what I'm always thinking about when I'm trying to create environments that affirm student identities and make them feel connected. We have an increasing need to really understand culture and the impact that it has on educational experiences. We talk about culture a lot. We talk about being culturally responsive, and we really want to get into what does that actually mean? How do you operationalize that? Culturally affirming practices are really important, ones that affirm and promote student engagement and success. And we also have to rely on our own self-reflection and awareness to support our own professional growth and educator effectiveness. This is this iterative process, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, where I'm constantly being self-reflective of the impact that I have on my students at the graduate level, on the schools that I work with on the K-12 level. I'm constantly thinking about how I show up. And what does that mean for the relationships? What does that mean for the students that I'm working with? And how does that impact them on a regular basis? What are some basic assumptions about our educational systems? One, that schools are microcosms of our greater society. In many ways, though, the historical structure and purpose of schooling is pretty contradictory to current law and public policy. So when we think about, again, schools being microcosms of our greater society, we see that there's this change over the last decade or a couple of decades where there's an increasingly diverse population in our schools that's not always reflected in every aspect of students' lives. Schools are structured to reproduce the norms of the dominant culture, but we have to ask ourselves, what is that dominant culture? What are the norms that we're reproducing, and who does that serve? And how does it serve different students? The other thing about educational systems is, the extent to which knowledge of students' home and community context is invaluable in understanding classroom behavior and academic performance. And so again, this is where we talk about how do we naturally start to think about the cultural and contextual influences that have an impact on our students and have an impact on our ability to form relationships with them. Before moving forward, it's important for me to talk to you about how I conceptualize culture. And it's a bit of a lengthy definition, but I spent 6 years in grad school coming up with it, so indulge me for just a second. So culture is a set of values, beliefs, or behaviors shared by a group of people. We know that we hear that definition all the time. I extend this in education to say it's based on race or ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic status, experiences, or other unifying denominators. And I want to pause there. What do I mean by other unifying denominators? I mean that I don't always know the cultural influences that have an impact on my students, right? As a teacher, as an educator, I want to know where are they from. I want to get out into the community. I want to know what are the factors that have an influence on them, whether it's language, whether there are things that happen in the community. So when I say unifying denominators, I'm saying that culture is not this finite thing where it only means these specific characteristics, right? We think about like, what are the things that have an impact on your students? And that might look different. And then there's the whole intersectionality piece, right? What does it mean to be a Black student who experienced trauma? What does it mean to be a white student from a rural setting? All of those different nuances have an impact on how kids show up and the impact that it has on their educational experience. The other piece is culture permeates throughout context, and it guides the way that we assign meaning to, the way that we interact, and the way that students adapt to environments. It's ever evolving, and it results from intra and interpersonal experiences, development, and growth. And so that's why I say that even in a school that is all Black or all white, there's still cultural differences because different students perceive the environment in different ways. When I first started working with the PBIS Center, and I came to UConn, I was working with George Sugai, and we were constantly having these conversations because a lot of my work focuses on perspective. Because I think that the way that we perceive an environment is our reality, right? Real or not, like that's still my reality. And it's important to understand, how do students perceive the environment? Because if our purpose is to create schools that are responsive to our needs, who better to ask if that's happening than the students themselves? So when we were having these conversations, George and I would say, well, does behavior drive feelings, or do feelings drive behavior, or behavior drive feelings, or feelings drive behavior? And it goes back and forth. we sort of ended with this reciprocal sort of cycle where there's behavior drives feelings and feelings drive behavior. And that's why, again, perceptions are really important because they do have an impact on how much I'm willing to engage. They have an impact on my relationships with peers, on my relationships with teachers. They have an impact on my perceptions of academic futility. Can I do well in school, even if I try my best? And so when I think about that definition of culture, again, there's so many different aspects that are included in that. And this list is not finite, but we're talking about gender identity, nationality, community, sexuality. When we're talking about, Latino students or Latinx students, we know that that group is not is not homogenous. And we know that there's a lot of diversity within that group. The same with Black students, Asian students, white students. And so in understanding the school communities, we all have to be willing to look at when we're applying these core principles of PBIS, what does that mean for my students? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for this district? What does that mean for this school? And bring it back. So the great thing about PBIS is that there are these core features, these core tenets that help us to build the framework. But within that framework, there's a lot of room where we have to be asking ourselves, what does that mean here? How does that translate to this environment? When I talk about a minoritized group, I'm talking about subordinate groups whose members have significantly less control or power in society, schools, towns, the workplace, than other dominant or majority groups. So I can be in a majority minoritized school, but they still have less power than, let's say, white counterparts or students in more affluent schools. So it's also a group that experiences narrowing opportunities relative to success, education, wealth, etc., that's disproportionately low compared to their numbers in society. And so that's why even the slide earlier where I talk about, well, what percent of students are in special education and what percent of students are in our public schools, and are those numbers the same when we look at proportionality? Part of what I'll talk about in a little bit is how do we use our data to guide our decision making, because that's another key part. So these are some of the racialized groups that we talk about, or minoritized groups that we talk about: racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, and religious groups. One of the things I want you to think about as we continue to have this conversation is how much on a scale of 0 to 100% is your life impacted by race or ethnicity? How much is your life impacted by your gender or your sexual orientation? How much is your life affected by your religion? And so I think about that often when I'm interfacing and interacting with other people, because it's important for us to be able to understand the perspective of other individuals. For me, I think about race and ethnicity a lot, often, all the time, right? But I might think about other things less often. So I want you to think about that and ponder on that as we continue to engage. The thing that we have to also acknowledge is that sometimes there are these cultural mismatch or these hidden rules that aren't always clear to our students about what are the expectations, about what does it mean to be a good student? What does it mean to use your inside voice? What does it mean to do your work quietly? And so we have to, I was just earlier working on something related to code switching. When we talk about code switching, what is that? Using different language, switching language and communication styles based on the settings. But that's a skill that has to be taught, right? The way that I communicate with my colleagues in a work meeting is different than the way that I communicate with my family at a Thanksgiving dinner. And that's code switching, right? And that's something, though, that I've had to learn over the years. And so it's important for us to understand that sometimes there are these mismatches. The puzzle pieces don't always fit together when you think about the student's home setting and when you think about their school setting. But that doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. That doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? Code switching is an adaptive skill. How do I help you thrive in this environment? And we can do that without also sending the message that who you are is not good enough or that who you are is wrong. And so when we think about these hidden rules and how they affect behavioral expectations and communication styles, it's important to consider, where are those clashes? Where is there not overlap? And how do we work together to create new norms that are reflective of the student culture and also the school context? The other important point is, what is the difference when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion? When we talk about diversity, we're talking about pure numbers, right? That there are, 20% of students who are Black, 28% of students who are Latinx, and so on and so on. So we have a really diverse school, but that's just showing up in numbers. We have diversity in a lot of different settings. Inclusion, though, is something different. That is the extent to which people's thoughts and ideas are solicited, are included, are used to make decisions, right? So it matters not if I'm in a diverse setting, but the only voices that are being heard are those of white males or those of the dominant group. It only matters if my voice counts also, right? So I'm sure you've seen the hashtag representation matters, and that it's important to have diverse settings, but we're also pushing for inclusion, the sort of integration of different values and perspectives. And then when we think about equity, that is the fair and equitable treatment, access, and opportunity. So how do we make sure that in these diverse settings, voices are heard and valued so that everyone has equitable access to education, to extracurricular activities, to relationship building in school, so that we can foster this sense of belonging, this sense of connectedness. And to me, connectedness is a critical feature of kids' educational experiences. We know that in schools where students connect with at least one adult, that has a tremendous impact on their academic outcomes, right? So some of my schools, one of the activities that we do seems very simple. It's called Preferred Adult Survey. They literally ask students, who is your preferred adult? And they want to make sure that everybody has an adult. And for those students who can't identify one, they make sure to pair them with one. Something that takes 5 minutes and seems really simple, but has a huge impact on students because they know that if something's going on, they have an adult that they can default to, an adult that they can talk to. And so we all want to get to a place where everyone feels that they belong in schools, because the reality is there are so many students that show up who don't feel like they belong. There's so many students that show up and go throughout the school day and no one ever says, hey, Jonathan, or good morning, it's good to see you. And they feel invisible. And we don't want that for students because we know that that has an impact on their engagement. So when we talk about the educational experiences of BIPOC students, you'll hear me use some of these terms interchangeably: minoritized and BIPOC. BIPOC are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We know that there's academic underachievement. We know that there's discipline disproportionality, social, emotional, and mental challenges. And we want to know, how do we ensure that there's not this erasure of cultural values, norms, and behaviors? So those are the things that we talk about often, these factors where we see that there are differences between minoritized students and traditionally white middle-class students. But I also want to make clear that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So don't just consider the present either, consider the history and the collective experience. So I go into schools oftentimes where there's diverse student populations, and the teachers will say, well, I think the students here, they really get along well, and I think that they really feel connected, and I don't think that we really have any issues related to like race in our school. And sometimes we have to think about not just the present, but like, what are the historical influences that also have an impact on how students show up in school, and how that affects us when we're talking about expectations, when we're talking about relationships, and how that manifests in different biases. So we all want our students to love school. We all want them to feel included. We want them to feel like they belong. But we all have these blind spots also. And so I challenge you, even in the most diverse schools, to still think about what are the historical and the present influences that have an impact on students' racialized identity and other identities. The example earlier are the media, the things that we've seen in the media over the last 18 months, even in schools where students feel where they might have the best relationships. The trauma that Black and brown people are experiencing shows up in school. The trauma that the Asian American community is experiencing shows up in school in different ways. And sometimes we're oblivious to that because we think that students have these great relationships, but there's sometimes these underlying factors that, fester and really have an impact. The other thing that comes up a lot is it cultural responsive? Is it equity? Is it culturally informed? Is it critical race theory? Is it all of these different things? These terms can be used interchangeably. What I focus on is equity, and really from a social justice perspective. So like, what am I doing to actively create experiences that are affirming for all students in my classroom, in the school? And that is really important because I'm thinking about my actions on a day-to-day basis. I don't get complacent and say, oh, I did this, I really connected with this student, and so I'm good to go. Like, that changes. And our students change from year to year. And so it's this iterative process of assessing, what am I doing to actively turn around on that sidewalk, that moving sidewalk, and change the systems that are in place. That start in my classroom, spread to my school and my district and my state. The other way that I explain this is using the house on fire analogy. And so when we talk about, for example, Black Lives Matter, and people say, what about all lives matter? Why, what about that? Why don't we say all lives matter? And my response is this: if you lived in a neighborhood with all these different homes and apartments, and someone said, well, which student is the most important? You would say, well, they're all important, right? It doesn't matter what home they live in, what it looks like, they're all important. And we want to make sure that they all feel welcome and they all feel supported, right? But if there's a house that's on fire and the fire truck comes and they say, well, which house is it? Where do I go? Well, you're not going to say, hey, all the homes are important. You need to go check each one and you'll get to the one that's on fire. You're going to say, go to the house that's on fire, right? Because if that house is on fire, then there is an immediate need there. And we also know that if you don't get to that house in time, that it's going to affect the other homes also. And so I think about that when we talk about, well, Black Lives Matter. Black lives matter, yes, all lives matter. But at this particular time, the racial inequities, the community is on fire, and there's particular attention that needs to be paid to the Black and Brown community. Still, if we talk about religious minorities, we see the same things happening, right? Their houses are on fire. And so again, if the fire truck comes and they say, well, which house is it? Which house is it? We're not going to say, make sure you go and check all of those houses. We're going to say, go to the house that's on fire. Help that community, because one, it's important to put out the fire. Two, if we don't, then it has an impact on all of us. Same with the LGBTQ plus community. The same with students with disabilities. The same with students experiencing food and income insecurity. And the same with students with intersecting identities. There are multiple houses that are on fire. And so when we say all students, we do mean all students, but we also have to be realistic and recognize that at different times, there are certain students and certain communities that need targeted and intentional supports because their house is on fire. So tying that to the critical features of PBIS, when we say, well, how do we get to those communities? How do we support students with disabilities? How do we support Black and Brown students? How do we support the LGBTQ plus community? How do we support students who are struggling with food and housing security? All of these are going to be integrated within a PBIS system, because we have to think about our data, we have to think about our systems, and we have to think about our practices. And again, I imagine this world where it says supporting staff behavior, supporting decision-making, supporting evidence-based interventions, and we can remove culturally relevant and culturally valid and culturally knowledgeable, because we want that to be this natural process. But I do recognize that because for most of us, even going through undergrad and going through graduate school, how many people actually had lessons or courses on cultural responsiveness, on social justice? I can think about even one in my graduate training, right? So even though we know that these things are important, we have to be having conversations about them, because we can't assume that we know how to do this. And so we can have all these conversations, be culturally responsive, include all students, but what does that look like? How do we operationalize that? And I hope that you can walk away today with some examples. So the way that I talk about culture responsive teaching and culture responsive interactions is through an analogy with the pomegranate. But also I recognize that not everybody likes pomegranates. And so I'm also, if you don't like pomegranates, think about an avocado or a watermelon. It's not quite as difficult, but indulge me for a second. So when I think about pomegranates, I think about culture responsive education, and I sometimes buy pomegranates and I never get to them because they take a lot of work to get to the good part. And so I buy them, but they just kind of go to waste because I didn't put in the energy. So I think about that with culture responsive education with my students. I'll talk about. So I think about my students and I'm like, I know that they show up with all these different influences, right? By the time that they've especially came to grad school, I've read their personal statements. I've, seen where they went to college. I've talked to them about why they want to be a school psychologist. And I know that in order for them to be a good school psychologist, I need to be able to help them tap into understanding the impact of culture and context on student experiences. But sometimes, if I don't have the energy, then that pomegranate goes to waste. Then I say, I can't keep letting these pomegranates go to waste because I know that if I can get to the middle, then it's going to pay off. So the second piece of that is I start to cut through. And for me, in the world of sort of culture responsive, that means acknowledging that I have to acknowledge that culture has an influence on my students. That cutting through is sort of waking up. That cutting through is recognizing that I cannot be colorblind because colorblind does not serve us well. I grew up being colorblind. My mom saying, treat everybody the same, right? I understand that. And I understand why that was the narrative because we weren't having these conversations. But now we are. So that cutting through can get messy. Sometimes the pomegranate juice kind of squirts on you and stuff. It's not always nice. It's not always easy. But that is the recognizing that I can't pretend that all my students are the same and that they've all had the same experiences. I have to be able to start to dig into that. And even in digging into that, that means that I have to recognize that I'm not the same and that I am influenced by culture. And that has an impact on the way that I see people and the way that I interact. The next piece then is, okay, I'm committed to this, but where do I start? Right? There are 100 books on the books to read about, how to support minoritized students. There are so many different websites, so many tabs open. There's so many resources. So when you get to the even middle of the pomegranate, you're trying to get through the flesh and trying to figure out, well, what resources do I need? What resources are going to be helpful for me? And so that's the same process that I go through when trying to get to the seeds in the pomegranate is trying to understand what resources are the ones that I need because I can't read 100 books. I can't go to 100 different websites. And so it's that navigating through different resources, hopefully not just by yourself, but navigating from a systems level approach through different resources. Because what happens is when I get to the good part of the pomegranate, once you get there, then you say, oh, this was worth it. This is when things get good. This is when my students start to make connections about the impact of how they show up. This is when my students start to feel that they're a part of the school. This is when my students start to feel that they're respected and not tolerated. This is when my students start to feel that they're part of the curriculum and they can see themselves in the stories of Cinderella and they can see themselves in the literature and they see themselves in the history. That's where we get to where we want to go. But again, it's not an easy process. It's not a process where we just wake up and say, oh, I've arrived. There's no certificates that are handed out because it's this iterative process. In fact, every time that I think that I got it, I'm like, okay, I understand my students. Then the next cohort comes in and I got to relearn different things. And so being culture responsive for me is acknowledging, one, how do I show up? Two, that it's this continuous process that I engage in to be able to support my students in the ways that they need to be supported. And understanding that, though, I also have to, again, think about, well, how do they show up? And so let's say I gave you this quiz, and let's say that your next 2 paychecks were contingent on you getting all of these questions or these responses correct. If I said, how do you say hello from around the world? And I gave you 5 minutes, no Google, no phone, no nothing. And I said, I want you to write down the response and how you say hello from all these different languages. And your next 2 paychecks are contingent on you getting all of these right. I'd be stressed, right? I'd be pretty stressed because I haven't I haven't had the opportunity to learn how to say hello in all of these different languages. So I'm being assessed on something that like I haven't even had the opportunity to learn, right? If I say, okay, well, here's how you say hello in all these different languages. Practice this, do note cards, practice with other people, and then come back in 2 weeks and we'll do this again, then I'll likely feel more confident because I've been given the tools, the resources. We're gonna have study sessions. Different people will learn in different ways. You can have it on audio, you can write it down, then I'll feel more confident. But if I haven't been given the opportunity to learn and I'm asked to perform, how am I supposed to succeed? And so when we talk about the achievement gap versus the opportunity gap, I often refer to it as the opportunity gap, because when we say achievement gap, it's almost this like presumption that even if I do all of this work, they're not really going to be able to do well, or they're not going to be able to do as well as this student or as well as their counterpart. And so it's important for us to recognize that instead of thinking about this achievement gap, we dispel this myth of inferiority or characteristics that are less than or need to be fixed. It is true that when Black and brown students show up to school, when students who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds show up to school, when ESL students show up to school, when students with disabilities show up to school, they are starting at a different point than their counterpart who is white, middle class, doesn't have a disability, doesn't have any mental health problems. They're showing up at different points. We have to acknowledge that. But what we also have to do is recognize what are the opportunities that we're putting in place for students to be successful. Because if a student shows up and I say, oh goodness, I had their 3 siblings, like they're not going to do well, or they come from this neighborhood, or their parents don't care about school, then I've already decided that they're not going to be successful. I've already decided that because of your zip code, because of the color of your skin, because of your IEP, you're not going to be successful. And though historically in education, we have seen the underachievement of these groups, it's not because of genetics. It's not because of these innate inferiorities. It's because of systems that are in place that have either created or inhibited access to learning opportunities for students. And so for me, I'm thinking, well, how do I create these opportunities for learning? Because it's unreasonable to ask someone to perform or to do something that they haven't had the opportunity to learn. With that comes debunking or getting rid of this culture as a deficit, this idea, these deficit-based explanations that assert that deficiencies in the home environment are a result in a lack of skills and knowledge that affects school performance. Because you came from this household, you're not going to be able to do well in school. Well, how do we think about other ways for students to do well? Right? When we see these stories of students being successful, Black and brown students, students with disabilities, that should not be the exception. That should be the norm, even though they might have gotten there in a different way. This deficit as a difference as a deficit model is the attribution or lack of student achievement to cultural factors and failure to a cultural group, where we assume that because they come from poverty, they're not going to do well. Well, it's true. They start school with on average 250 fewer vocabulary words. Maybe we need to engage in more open-ended conversations versus closed-ended conversations to promote vocabulary. I recognize that, but I can set my classroom up to be responsive to those needs so that students from certain cultural groups aren't sort of already put into these categories that they can't be successful. And so there's definitely this shift from difference is not a deficit. And how do we shift to this strengths-based perspective where we incorporate experiences and beliefs in educational learning and the curriculum and relationships. And this is really key. It's key that we think about the strengths-based perspective, because our focus then is on what the students can do. My focus is on stopping these negative thoughts that I have when a student shows up, stopping those immediate thoughts, identifying strengths, and also practicing empathy, but being wary of sympathy, because sympathy can be debilitating. Because if I start to feel bad for a student, then I start to have lower expectations for them. They come from a tough home life. They got themselves up. They got themselves ready for school. Nobody is there to help them. But guess what? They showed up and they're here and they're in school. So how do I focus on the fact that they're here? How do I focus on their strengths? Because that's what's important, that they're here. And so instead of this sympathy perspective and saying, oh, I feel bad for them, focus on they're here and what do we do with that time? And focus on how do I create these opportunities for them to be successful? The other key things that I talk about with respect to a strengths-based perspective is every individual, every group, every family, every community has strengths. Our job is to find them. Trauma and abuse, illness and struggle, they may be harmful, but they may also be a source of challenge and opportunity, where we view everybody through the lens of hope. And I think that's really important. We know that a lot of students are experiencing trauma and abuse and a lot of struggle. But still, how do we recognize that there's resiliency in that they're still here? And how do we build upon that? Assume that you don't know the upper limits or the capacity of students to grow and change. Don't put these glass ceilings on students just based on superficial or information that you see on paper. Take the individual, group, and community aspirations seriously, right? What is possible for students when we don't put limits on them? If a student, I know that they're struggling and they don't do their work, and one student doesn't do it, and I say, okay, I know you're tired, that you can stop there. And then this other student, I'm like, come on, buddy, I know you can do it, take a break and keep going. Then we've already started to create two different paths for students, because I think that I'm doing them a favor by lowering expectations, but all I'm doing is signaling to them that I don't think that you can do this, or that I'm giving you a break, but they see that you're not doing the same thing to the other students. So how do we push students and have high expectations and still hold them accountable? In order for us to really, like I said, implement PBIS in the way that is most effective, we have to be thinking about culture, climate, and context that have an impact on pro-social behaviors, decision-making, and student outcomes. The core features around developing this multi-tiered system and developing a social culture that's responsive to student needs is, again, contextually and culturally informed. And what do I mean by that? We've seen the tier over and over again. And what we're saying is, how do we make sure that when I'm thinking about social skills training, when I'm thinking about teaching behavioral expectations, when I'm thinking about academic support, I'm also thinking about how that looks different across various students and how to support their needs. Some of that is giving them background knowledge. Some of that is understanding that students communicate in different ways. Some are going to raise their hand and tell you they don't understand. Some are going to retreat. Some are going to try to avoid. How do I integrate different stories into the curriculum so that students can see themselves in the curriculum, into writing activities? What does that look like? And the other thing that I think is really important is for all of us to recognize that in doing PBIS and being culturally responsive, we don't have to choose between all of these different initiatives and frameworks that are out there. PBIS is the framework. And so even if you're implementing restorative justice or SEL training, how do we merge those silos? It's not like pick door number one and that's what you have to sit with. Instead, I challenge us to look at it where PBIS is the framework. It's not an either or choice. And SEL or restorative justice, I threw in Check and Connect, those are embedded within the framework. So often we say, okay, we're doing PBIS, but we have a grant to do SEL, so we're going to just focus on SEL. That's great to focus on social emotional learning, but how can I do that within the framework? Right? So it's not instead of, it's within. So that then looks like, how does SEL look at the tier 1 level? How does it look at the tier 2 level? Because everybody needs some degree, right, of social emotional learning, but some students need increasing levels of support. How do I utilize morning meeting at the elementary level, homeroom at the middle school level, advisory or other things at the high school level to teach those skills? And what does that mean as we go up the tiers? And what am I teaching? Right? SEL, teaching SEL, social emotional learning skills, we still have to understand, how do students express distress? What are coping strategies for them? And that varies across different cultures and across different students. And so we have to be aware of that. But the key here is that we don't have to choose. There are a lot of great things out there, but we don't have to choose. We don't have to choose what. Instead, we're choosing where we're putting different initiatives and what that looks like. Because again, PBIS is not the intervention, it's the framework, a decision-making framework. And so if we use that, then we then can increase access, we can increase quality, and we can increase quantity. Because it doesn't feel like we're in this constant circle of starting new initiatives. Instead, we're embedding new initiatives, but not throwing out the work that we've done before. Where every year we show up and there's a new initiative. We don't have to do that. It's embedding those different things. And when we're doing that, we have to be thinking about who gets access, who is the quality for, when do people get access, where are there areas of over and under representation, and who is excluded from access. And there are a couple of different ways to do that. But in general, when I think about sort of the pedagogy that supports culture responsive education, there's this institutional, personal, and instructional domain. I referenced them a little bit earlier, a little bit more detail though. From the institutional perspective, that's on how is a school organized? What are the school policies and procedures that are in place? How do you use your PBIS team and build systems? Right? So that teachers don't have to do it by class based on their classroom. It's at the school level. How do we have policies and procedures that are in place that create equity, that create consistency, and that create environments that are predictable for students? So that also means establishing resources, trainings, services for teachers that are relevant to the cultural needs of students. Again, how do we operationalize all this great, beautiful language around being culture responsive? How do we operationalize that? What does that look like in practice? I talked about the personal domain. Again, I have to be reflective of my own values and beliefs and how they impact relationships. What's my understanding about what does it mean to be a good student? Not everybody is going home, these days and changing out of their school clothes and doing homework and having their snack and then going outside to play. I recognize that there are different things that are in play now for students in terms of what it looks like to be a good student. I have to think about what's my own trauma? What are my own cultural sort of influences that affect me in positive and not so positive ways? And how does that influence my relationships with students? And then the last piece is the instructional domain. I was reading a text recently and said, we can have equity and we can have excellence. Right? So we can create opportunities for students and we can have equity and excellence. We don't have to choose. It doesn't mean that, because we're making things equitable for students that we have to sacrifice quality and quantity. We don't. And sometimes that's an assumption, right? That, if we increase access for students into upper level courses and other opportunities, that we're lessening opportunities or we're lessening the quality for other students. That's not the case. How do we make sure that we're valuing students' experiences and their input and relying on multiple methods of instruction and assessment to meet their needs? This is with implementing PBIS. This is with implementing the curriculum. This is with building relationships. How do we think about multiple ways that we're doing that? Because when we look at our data, the problem is not usually that we don't have enough data. The problem has been, what do we do with the data? In fact, we usually have more data than we know what to do with. So how do we examine overall data, but also data across subgroups? And Eric mentioned this earlier about how do we, at your school levels, use data to make decisions and use it in a meaningful way. Because like I said, sometimes we have a lot of data, but we don't know what to do with it. And so how do we make intentional decisions about what data we need and how we use it? This is, in general, what we know about PBIS in the research is that it decreases when it's implemented with fidelity. We see that there's decreases in exclusionary discipline practices, reduces the disproportionality gap between white and Black and Latinx students, and increases pro-social behaviors. We know that there are a lot of positive outcomes that we have seen with PBIS. And I think that that's really important. And again, I'm saying PBIS as this framework where you can still integrate these other initiatives. But we know that it has been effective at reducing these gaps and decreasing exclusionary discipline practices. But there's still more work to do. If we can bridge the cultural divide between students in schools, then we have a better chance at not just eliminating differences and disproportionality, or we have a better chance at not just reducing the differences, but eliminating them, right? So we've made strides in decreasing these disproportionality gaps and decreasing exclusionary discipline practices, but how can we bolster that by considering culture and context so that we can get rid of those things and really create equity? So one way to do that, I encourage you to examine district level data and school level data. We have to disaggregate the data because a lot of times the surface level data does not tell the whole story. I can say, oh, 75% of my students, or 85% of my students are doing well, and 85% of students are passing our exams. But when I disaggregate, I see that looks different across different groups. And so how do we interpret data patterns across different subgroups? Race and ethnicity, students with disabilities, English language learners. And in your school, there might be additional groups, right? So again, that's any unifying denominator. So economically disadvantaged. How do you break out into teams and work with your building-based administration to examine this data? Which eventually trickles down to identifying specific students. I practice this process of revise, review, and retool on a regular basis. So not just using annual data, but how am I constantly looking at data and using it to make decisions? And part of being able to do that means that I need the data to be accessible. So this is an example. If I wanted to look at discipline data, there are two things I want to look at. What percent of the population is the group, which is the orange, and what percent of them represent the discipline referrals? For example, if Black boys in the school represent 5% of the school population, but 1/5 of school discipline referrals, then that means I need to dig deeper. What I want to know next is, what are they getting referrals for? Oftentimes, it's these 3 Ds, these subjective behaviors, what I call defiance, disruptiveness, and disrespect. So this data starts to help me to look at, well, what are those patterns that I need to look more at? And even you can include students in special ed and students who are economically disadvantaged. But this is just a literal count of like what percent do they make up in the school population and what percent of referrals. And if we're talking about equity, then we would expect for those numbers to be to be about the same. If they're 5% of the population, they should represent about 5% of referrals. If it's way more than that, 4 times as much, then what does that mean for our school, for our system? Another way to look at it that I think is really helpful is, again, looking at the students and what percent they are of the population, and then looking at what services are they getting. What percent of students are receiving counseling services, check in, check out, individualized support. And then you calculate the difference. So in places where there are huge differences between the number of students, the percent of students in the school being Black, and them only 5% of them receiving additional services, but 20% of them receiving discipline referrals, it's this back and forth between, okay, how is this data helping me to understand what the dynamics are? So I talk about this as like being data rich and analysis poor. Like, how do we consider this data and use it in a way that's helpful? The other thing that this helps us do is, if you do this by school, I can look at the patterns within districts and see where they're consistent patterns in terms of access across different groups of students. And what is that difference? If it's negative, they're underserved. If it's positive, then they're overserved. And again, it's not about taking away, but it's about increasing access for those who don't have it. I talked about this a second ago. I want to talk about a couple things that come up when I'm talking about facilitating culture responsive PBIS, the power of the name. So we talk about what are some key strategies. So I want to leave with a few strategies. One, when we say sticks and stones may break our bones, but words never hurt, that's not true. Words hurt. We know that words hurt. And so one of the things I think about is something that it could be, it seems as simple as like the name. How do we ask students, what is your preferred name? Or how do you pronounce your name at the start of the school year? Because sometimes we give students nicknames and because it's too difficult for us, or because there are 3 of them in the room. And then students go throughout their whole educational career. I've read so many articles and heard so many stories from teachers where the teacher called them the wrong name all year. And that sends a message, right? Like, if someone is not willing to acknowledge your name, that's like the first message that you get, that like, I'm not important enough. Whether it's intentional or not, I'm not important enough. So how do we instead send a message, you matter, you're important to me? So I don't pre-assign nicknames because for students, I work with some colleagues, I might get the name incorrect, or I ask them, do you have a preferred nickname? But I ask them instead of assuming. Students shouldn't have to change themselves or their names to make others feel comfortable, right? I say it may take me some time, but I'll keep trying because your name is important to me. And that's really, really, really critical. Another key thing is, how do we create shared norms? So how do we work with learners to articulate classroom rules, shared ownership, to build trust and buy-in? Because the classroom culture of high expectations, if it's built by the teacher and student, is going to be more likely. Because when something happens and I say, hey, we created these norms together, remember, if this, then that. We created this together. Because what we know is that disproportionately, learners are being removed from classrooms and permanently removed from school for minor infractions, defiance, disrespect, disruptiveness. And a majority of these students are students of color. So instead, how do we work with students to establish high expectations for themselves and allow them to rise to the occasion? I remember when I used to be in school, I would kind of show up on the first day of school. There was a poster with like 5 class rules and we just kind of fell in line. But now I think about, how do we create our classroom norms together so that we can hold each other accountable to them? The other thing is pre-correcting and prompting to remind students what's expected in an easy to understand way. And so getting into this cycle of pre-correcting. So it's not always, okay, you didn't do this, so you're going to get in trouble, or there's this negative consequence. How do I get in the habit of pre-correcting? Using agreed upon nonverbal signals to communicate and minimize disruptions during instruction. So if I know that a student is off task or something, if I walk by and we know if I tap on your desk, or if I do a hand signal or something like that, then they know, hey, get back on task. I need you to do this, versus having to stop and interrupt the process. But doing that together with students gives that shared ownership. Create the win-then statements to clearly explain the expectations. And finally, use respectful redirection, a calm tone, neutral body language, clear and concise wording. I practice this all the time. Like, how am I making sure that I'm using a neutral term, a calm tone, when I'm correcting students, or when I'm redirecting students, which is really, really key. The last piece of this, or another piece of this, is when I'm talking about social emotional learning, how do we create environments that allow for students to engage and that's inclusive for all learners? So ignoring the impact of culture, this color blindness, and ignoring the cultural assaults is antithetical to everything about social emotional learning, right? If I'm saying I'm going to approach it from this colorblind perspective, everybody needs the same thing. When I'm talking about the social emotional learning needs of students, that doesn't make sense, right? Like that's inherent. My emotions and how I express them is derived from cultural norms, from my experiences. So if I say that there's this one size fits all approach, everybody's going to cope the same way, that doesn't align. And what it has done historically is not allow Black and brown students to become their true selves, to express themselves in ways that are natural to them. And so when we're thinking about, again, these cultural considerations, we have to be thinking about whose culture are we considering? And we use the term all the time, the whole child. I want to educate the whole child. But how can we be educating the whole child when culture is not a consideration? That's contradictory. The other piece of this is there is no way to work with a whole child, like I said, when culture is ignored, discounted, or trivialized. So we can ensure high quality multicultural content that exists in the curriculum and SEL strategies and sessions. Be proactive in engaging in professional development to become culturally competent. Like I said, I understand that requires explicit takeaways, because we can have these conversations all day long, but how do we transfer this research to practice when we keep saying be culture responsive, be culture responsive? What does that look like in the classroom, right? Comes down to like understanding names. It comes down to understanding students' emotions. It comes down to asking them about what are their coping skills and not assuming or assigning different coping skills. The last thing that I'll talk about here is how do we get rid of this colorblind and these colorblind initiatives and move away from that? A classroom culture of high expectations can still be built. I think I mentioned that earlier. And thinking about how do we make sure that, I think the slide was repeated, sorry. How do we make sure that we're moving out of this being colorblind and I don't see culture, and acknowledging that and asking students to share who they are with us as we share who we are with them. It's like when we see students, when they see us in the grocery store and they're like, wait, you buy groceries, or you have like a dog, or like you're human? Like, yes, we have things that are in common, and that's how we can connect. And that's really important. And so I think about, moving beyond being colorblind and thinking about what are ways that we can connect, because that's what's going to be most important. So again, my goal here is working towards removing the brackets, so that the process of implementing the PBIS framework naturally includes considering context and considering culture. Also, how do we find touch points? There are multiple ways to connect with students. Integrate cultural perspectives and affirm students' identities. I might not connect with you based on race, but we can connect on something that might be as simple as sports. We can connect on growing up in the same neighborhood, growing up in the same community. Find different touch points. Don't assume that because we have a lot of differences that we don't also have a lot of similarities. Small changes leave big imprints. Things as simple as a name, the way that we acknowledge students, greeting students, those have a huge impact on students all the time. And they're seemingly small, but they have a big impact. Lastly, use the framework with existing data-based practices. Don't jump from one initiative to another. Integrate instead of throwing away. So when you're talking about social emotional learning and restorative justice and other initiatives, think about how do I embed them within the framework, because the framework is designed to help you use data to make decisions about who needs what. When you go back to looking at creating your tables about who's getting access to services and what does discipline look like, then I can say, okay, who do we provide additional social emotional learning support for? Who do we provide restorative justice, or where do we implement restorative justice? So use the framework with evidence-based practices. And again, I'll reiterate, remove the brackets. We're removing the brackets because this becomes a part of the process, not some add-on to the framework. So I'll stop there. I left my email there. I left my Twitter handle in case you want to at me on Twitter. And I saw in the chat, I will be sharing the presentation. I will email it to Mary right after this so that everyone can have access to it. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. LaSalle. So timely, relevant, and kind of inspirational and hopeful for the ways that this can be connected to work that people have built on to make it better, stronger, and more relevant as well. So thank you so much for being with us today. There were some resources that were posted in the link that also come from the National Center. If you've seen those, I really encourage you to check those out if you have not. And there was a question in the chat about whether this session and others will be available and recorded. And we are recording them today, and we'll work on accessibility issues with that. And when that is ready, make those posted and available. And we'll repost the link where those will be found kind of as we go throughout the sessions as well. So again, great gratitude and thanks for joining us in partnership and working with us to be partners in this process as well. So with that, Tamara or Erin, do you want to do logistics as we break and move into the breakout sessions?
Sure. So I'm kind of shifting a little bit because I'm on the other link. So my camera's a little weird angle here right now, but so if you want to be in the session for establishing preliminary evidence for culturally responsive PBIS with Alexandria Rovers, you are going to stay in this link in this room. If you want to go to the PBIS classroom implementation presentation using the framework to promote culturally responsive engagement strategies, you will go to link 2. And we have a break from right now until 10:25. So you have a few minutes to log on and get settled in, fill up your coffee. So I think that's everything. Are there any other questions? Great, we'll enjoy the rest of the day.